Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm John Marchari, head of the Department of Drawings and Prints here at the Morgan. This talk, as many of you know, had to be rescheduled because of one of the freak snowstorms in the never-ending winter of 2018. So I'm grateful to you all for persisting and coming at a different time and weeks later. It's my pleasure to introduce David Freedberg, who is the Pierre Matisse Professor of the History of Art at Columbia University and director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America. Although probably best known for his books on the psychological response to art, such as his 1989 The Power of Images, David's more traditional art historical writing has focused on Dutch and Flemish art, and he's published extensively on Rubens. And it's in that context that we've asked him to speak today in connection with our exhibition, Power and Grace. I hope those of you who haven't had a chance to see that show yet will stop in on the way out. But first, please join me in welcoming David to the podium for his talk on Ecumenical Rubens.
Well, I'm touched that so many of you should be here today in the middle of the first beautiful day or the second beautiful day in ages. And the other reason that I'm slightly upset by the postponement, which of course was the will of God, is that I'm in between cataract operations today. So if I fall or if I falter, please forgive me. I'm having a little difficulty figuring out my text. I've added light, I've expanded, I've added bold, and usually, as you know, those of you who have heard me before, I like to walk around the stage. But in this case, I have to be rooted to this imperfectly printed text of mine, because the topic is so vast that if I don't attend to my text, we will be here for 2 hours instead of 1. So that's the apology. Here's the adaptation. I added 2 bits to my title, Empathy and Indifference, which will come forward towards the end. Both of those topics are interests of mine in these difficult days, the latter 2 topics. At any rate, it's an honor to give this lecture today in connection with a lovely exhibition curated by Ilona van Teunen and her colleagues here at the Morgan, who, as you know, Ilona, has left to become curator of drawings at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I also had the honor of being the academic advisor to the Drawings Institute here at the Morgan in its founding year, before I left to be director of the Warburg Institute in London for a couple of years. And now that I'm back, I'm thrilled that both Colin Bailey and John Marchari are here. I went away, they came here, under whom I don't know whether there's a causal relationship, but perhaps there is, under whom I foresee a new era in the study of drawings and their history. When Ilona asked me to give a talk about Rubens, I proposed a title which I thought was a gripping theme that had been little discussed. But my suggestion of ecumenical Rubens was initially nixed. I don't quite know why, but I think that the powers that be thought that a general audience wouldn't know what I meant by ecumenical, or that the term was too sentimental, in the sense of being a reference to Rubens's amazingly wide-ranging use of drawing. Even on the basis of the drawings in the show alone, one could show that artistically speaking, this is the one side of the easy side of the equation, Rubens was the most ecumenical draftsman. His range was all embracing, you know this, technically, iconographically, geographically, and aesthetically. We'll shortly come to the drawings in the show, but in the meantime, remember, just for example, how powerful his drawings can be. So these, of course, are not drawings in the show. So one of the great nudes from around figures from around 1612 used over and over again. I'm going to try not to comment on these drawings, because otherwise we really will be here forever. Portrait of his son, unusual landscape drawing. Some people still dispute this, but very beautiful. Wanted the reflections in the water to show you there. And then those wonderful early drawings, the death of Adonis, and then, of course, that wonderful portrait in colored chalks on the right. But what I meant by ecumenical, so this is just to get things going here, but what I meant by ecumenical was much more specific. I also want you to see this because you get a sense here of a variety of techniques, you know, the pen and wash over there, a little bit of body color, then, you know, black chalk, red chalk, white heightening, and so on. All these aspects of Rubens drawings which are the most praiseworthy of what he does as a draftsman, which aren't entirely represented in that little delicious show upstairs. But what I meant by ecumenical was much more specific. I mentioned it in the sense that some of you may think of in terms of the ecumenical councils of the church, such as those of Vatican II, which you all know, or those of the founding councils of Christianity, which were efforts basically to make, as indeed Vatican II, efforts to make the church universal, so to speak. So I was going to give you a brief rundown of those early Christian councils, but I'm trying to reduce the body of this talk so that we get to an end. So these and many subsequent so-called ecumenical councils may have aimed for unity, but they were actually doctrinally divisive and anything but ecumenical. In fact, as some of you know, the Greek word oikumene means the whole inhabited human world. And more specifically, in Christian theology, it means the movement towards unity of all believers in Christ, transcending differences of creed, ritual, and polity. But what has all of this to do with Rubens, you might ask? Not just with theology, fortunately. But let me begin with a personal story. I remember one day in the tea room at the Warburg Institute, it must have been sometime in the late 1970s, when the great Frances Yates came down, and Dame Frances Yates came down and sat down beside me. She was the author of what remains the best, I was very young and she was getting on. She was the author of what remains the best book ever written, On the Art of Memory. Her shock of white hair was striking, and with a kindly twinkle in her eye, she was quite unlike the grumpy old and middle-aged men who dominated the Institute in those days. And she asked me, "Do you think Rubens was a radical, a secret liberal, maybe even a Rosicrucian?" I nearly fell off my seat. Rubens, I thought to myself, that devoted Catholic, that conventional family man, the one who wouldn't even paint on Sundays because he wanted to observe the Sabbath, a secret liberal, a radical, maybe even a Rosicrucian, really? Swiftly I reviewed the evidence in my mind. There were his late and slightly boring designs about the triumph of Catholicism. Oh, there are more children, so there, you know, a design for one of the tapestries for the Descalzas Reales in Madrid. We could have classes on each of these. The scores of altarpieces for churches all over the Low Countries and Germany remind you the great Assumptions, the crucifixions, the raising of the cross, all those martyred and suffering saints. You'll see, oh, there's another crucifixion, and there, of course, this is the time I test my class, St. Andrew, you always remember, St. Andrew has the cross, the upside down St. Peter, and so on, even as some of you may remember with shock. I'm sorry that there are people up sitting at the back. You need to come right forward if you want to see how poor St. Levinus, I mean, this you know in Brussels, probably most of you in the audience know, but you can see poor St. Levinus is having his beard tugged out because his tongue is being fed to the dog over here. So if you go to Brussels, you can see this extraordinarily blood-dripping tongue just wrenched out from St. Levinus's mouth. So these are what we remember about the Rubens and Catholicism, amongst other things. The devotion to the Virgin, the supporter of the Jesuits, the great devoted, supporter of the Jesuits there, the great altarpieces of St. Ignatius Loyola and St. Francis Xavier. These, of course, in Vienna now, the favorite painter of the Augustinians and even the Dominicans with their rosary devotion. I can never resist showing this little-known picture in Toledo, Ohio, which, of course, is a product of painted for a Dominican church. In short, Rubens was surely the greatest of all Baroque religious painters. What could Dame Frances have meant? My head spun. After all, hadn't Rubens also said that he could only do drawings for title pages on Sundays? There's the Plantinian compasses. That he wanted his favorite saints for his own tomb, you see there. This is the great tomb in St. James in Antwerp, and with these favorite saints, all, of course, looking like him and the members of his own family. You can identify all those, the children. There's Albert there. There's maybe Hélène Fourmont in that case. Maybe that's his previous wife. All of them are together recording the relationship between his devotion and his love of his own family, famous. Consider the evidence from this exhibition alone. It's not so much the Old Testament drawings, like the copies after the Swiss artist Tobias Stimmer in his youth. So this he copied from an illustration, which I'll show you in a moment, from Tobias Stimmer. You can't see it at the back, so this means that you have to go to the exhibition afterwards. This very light pen and ink drawing, which actually has, I can barely see now myself, but you can see here, is the scolding wife of Job. Always felt, Job, as if he didn't have enough to contemplate, had an irritable wife scolding him for complaining. And here is, I don't know whether this is complaints that, the Germans talk about the Frau Weibermacht, but here I think they will be talking about something else, the nagging wife. And here, of course, is the Judith. You can just see cutting off the hair. Judith with a sword in that hand, reaching out for the cut-off head of Holofernes. And these, of course, came, as you can go and have a look. There's a wonderful copy of Tobias Stimmer's design here. You can just, if you remember, you can see here exactly. Rubens copied these illustrations when he was a boy. Another topic when he was a young man, before he went to Italy in 1600. So these are things which we could discuss at greater length in our classes, but we have to move forward. And then there's the wonderful black chalk drawing. I'm talking briefly about for Daniel in the Lion's Den, done from a studio, representing a studio assistant, the perfect drawing from the middle of the early part of the first, between 1612 and 1615, let's say, showing the perfect and vibrant knowledge of anatomy he had already acquired through his training by copying Ecochet drawings at the beginning of the century. So here, well, that's a bad illustration, but of the same drawing, which shows the heightening with white a bit more clearly, for example, in the forearm, there, and elsewhere on the body, which you can't see so clearly unless you go very closely. And here are these strange Ecochet drawings, which he did at the beginning of the century, probably, which only appeared at Sotheby's about 20 years ago. Whole series of drawings, which we know from copies which were made in the so-called Rubens Kantor in Copenhagen. It's also the drawings such as the St. Lambert from Clement Moore's collection, Chips Moore's collection, lovely wash drawing, not so well known, a typical Rubens preparatory drawing full of confidence and flair with this masterful combination of pen and ink, black chalk and wash that gives a sense of the conviction with which he portrayed saints, or as here, the triumph of good over evil, but as usual is trampling on a devil below. Triumph of good over evil, as in this drawing, probably made for the city of Liège, whose patron saint was in fact St. Lambert, and to whom its cathedral was dedicated. Then there are other drawings in the show which have abundantly Catholic dimensions, such as those, I love this, for the sparkling new Jesuit church in Antwerp. I knew it as a black church. Now it's been cleaned and it looks splendidly white, such as, the Roman churches look much better now, the Chiesa Nuova Santa Maria della Valle, and of course this is all related, a Jesuit architect. And here inside, Rubens did everything for this church. He did the design for the high altar, for the niche with the Virgin above, and of course he painted the high altar itself, and for above the entrance door there, he did these fabulous drawings, which are amongst the greatest drawings of trumpeting angels in the Morgan for the spandrels beside the door at the entrance. And they are also on show upstairs. So too, for that matter, is one of the more staid drawings for the Catholic Missal. These are the book illustrations which he did, published by the son of the great Antwerp printer, the son-in-law, of the great Antwerp printer Christopher Plantin. Plantin, we'll come back, Christopher, we'll come back to in a moment. His son-in-law continued that great press. And so you see one of Rubens' very typical, slightly staid, but always inventive drawings for title pages. So actually, the engraver got much more than Rubens did. He got 6 guilders per drawing like this, whereas the engravers got 20 guilders and up. So this, of course, was his peaceful Sunday afternoon work, for which he was not paid much at all, not much even in the case of his magnificent title page. Just to remind you of everything he did for the Catholic churches, of course, is the title page for the youthful poems of Pope Urban VIII himself, showing Samson tearing open the mouth of the lion in order to release the honey-producing bees that were the emblem of the Barberini popes. You see here, the bees emerge from the mouth of the lion, torn open here, in the form of the Barberini trigon, which you can see everywhere, these three bees across Rome for the papacy of Urban VIII. And so it went on, even to influence the more schematic drawings of his devoted pupil, Anthony van Dyck. We won't spend time on those here, but they're well represented in the little show too. There you see a rather wonderful martyrdom of St. Lawrence. At first sight, it looks like a lamentation, but in fact, it's St. Lawrence over there. Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine. This really vigorous drawing, pen and wash drawing, which he does probably around 1620, just before he goes to England, and then this rather wonderful Diana and Endymion on blue paper, which he did when he first went to England around 1627. Charles I, as you know, is getting really interested in assembling his collection, and he also was a great patron of Van Dyck. And then he's a master, this wonderful drawing here in the Dead Christ on blue paper, a support that Rubens never used and never quite attained although Van Dyck never quite attained the vivacious fluidity of his master. So those are the wonderful drawings you can see upstairs. So that's, in a way, the ecumenical Rubens from the point of view of his art, about which we have no doubt and to which we will return. So what could Dame Frances have meant? And astonished and trying to recover what she could possibly have intended, it suddenly dawned on me. Thank God I've scratched out a long detailed account here, so we don't have to worry about those, about the background to the situation in the Low Countries at the time. So, but what I do want to mention is, at that point in my life, as some of you may know, I was working on the problem of iconoclasm, and in particular the wave of image breaking that swept across the Netherlands from August 1566 on. I was studying the problem of why people attacked images, why images mattered so much to people that they not only adored and worshipped them, but also pulled them down in fury. So now all I need is this, so we can see the images being pulled down in Antwerp Cathedral in 1566, August 1566. There, that's a contemporary, more or less contemporary illustration by Hogenberg, came out in 1517. Here, an adaptation by Jan Luyken showing the ladders. These are incredibly interesting and influential illustrations about which I've written far too much. In fact, thousands of pages I've written on this problem, so I won't bore you with more of it here. But what began as iconoclasm, a war against images, turned into the downfall of the control of Spain in the Netherlands, in the region we now call Holland, under the leadership of the great rebel William of Orange, the establishment of a Protestant regime from there from 1609 on, and the definitive split between Holland and the country we now know as Belgium. Rembrandt, of course, was the great Protestant painter of the north, and the apparently most Catholic Rubens, the great painter of the southern Netherlands, the more conservative region that remained with Spain. The revolt of the Netherlands that began in 1566, 3 years before the death of Bruegel and 11 years before the birth of Rubens, lay at the origins of the greatest war ever between Protestant and Catholic in Europe, the so-called 30 Years' War. And in a flood of recognition, I realized what Dame Frances was suggesting. I should have realized it more swiftly. Like the great revolution it unleashed, iconoclasm in the Netherlands was a direct consequence, as much else in Europe, as all of you know, of the Protestant Reformation. First came Martin Luther's Theses of 1517, then the Henry VIII's schism with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, then the yielding of much of Germany, Switzerland, and France. All this shocked the Habsburg leaders of the Netherlands to the core. The Emperor Charles V himself a Fleming, because he was born in Ghent, clamped down on all resistance, and within a few years his son Philip II became even tougher and sent the notorious Duke of Alva to take charge. Iconoclasm had just broken out, the people were restive, the leaders of the rebellion were beheaded, William of Orange took over, the people were in crisis, and Bruegel himself, Bruegel, Rubens' great predecessor, lived through the so-called time of troubles. Although he famously painted the peasant scenes, we all know and love. That's one of the last pictures, painted in 1568, so 2 years after Iconoclasm, a whole other story we could lecture about. Although he famously painted scenes such as this and was once thought to be little more than a peasant himself, he was, of course, a deep and reflective individual, Bruegel, and shared a set of distinctive ethical and political views with his close friends Christopher Plantin, the greatest printer of his age, and Abraham Ortelius, the famous geographer and cosmographer, whose maps of the world finally brought the entire globe into knowable reach. They all shared a critical conviction that religious differences were only superficial, and that what mattered was their inner following, the inner following of the central moral dimension of Christ's existence in this world, that was pacific, tolerant, and open to all. Despite their outward beliefs, inwardly they knew that religious discord would only lead to further social and political divisions. In a letter to the historian Emanuel van Meteren, Ortelius referred to the destruction of the Christian world by the Catholic evil, the Gur fever, and the Huguenot dysentery. So all were bad. Catholic evil, the Gur, were the beggars, the people who were the rebels supporting William of Orange, and they were largely Protestant, and the Huguenot dysentery. All of them knew that in times of political dissent and intranational strife, the only solution was to work towards peace and concord. Incessantly, they thought about reconciliation between the religions as the true path to world peace. So we could have many, many texts about this pleading for the concordia mundi, the harmony of the world, and the conciliatory, ecumenical, and irenic mission with which intellectuals should proceed. Could give you many examples. The idea that accord between Protestants and Catholics could be attained by reason and by reasonable means became ever more important. You may think I'm wandering, but it now turns out that not only Plantin the printer and Ortelius the geographer were trying to achieve universal peace by bringing the warring religions together, so too were many of their friends, including Bruegel too, of course. So here a quick I just want to remind you that in the famous Carnival and Lent, which we haven't entirely deciphered, we have a clear allusion to the Catholic Church here, the beehive, the symbol of the Pope, in the form of a rather skinny monk, and here Martin Luther, the fat old monk, who indulged and drank and lost his temper. But in front of them, walking away from this mock strife at Carnival, is a couple, one with a hunchback, but they're going arm in arm, they're turning their back on strife, so you think that they are turning their back on strife. Why? He's got a humpback, shows he has problems too, but in fact they're walking away from this intra-religious strife, and yet, this is the great problem with Bruegel, they are preceded by a fool. One doesn't quite know what Bruegel is doing in this picture, but it's clearly an allusion to the irenical and ecumenical movements at the time. It's a mystery. Ordinary people are the protagonists, though. Ordinary people are the protagonists, though, in this picture, and ordinary people suffer, as you can see, for example, in the beggar over here, and where are the lepers? Oops, they're disappearing out of the picture there in this detail. So we could, again, talk about this forever. Much clearer is one of Bruegel's least known pictures, and one that most closely approaches a drawing, the beautiful little grisaille painting, which is now in the Courtauld Institute of Art, which I knew when it belonged to Count Ceylon. And it shows Christ and the woman taken in adultery, the quintessential biblical story of forgiveness. The point is made by the very words that Christ is writing on the pavement in front of him. which appears in Latin in the print Bruegel had made after this picture, but in fact there appears in Flemish. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Nothing could stand more clearly as the motto of this group, which also included Bruegel's fellow painter Marcus Gerards, who like Ortelius went to England and worked for Elizabeth I, and the great Flemish poet Jan van der Noot. It's almost certain that they all belonged to or identified with a famous sect of the time known as the Family of Love, which this is no Californian group of the early 60s. They were really calling themselves the Family of Love in the 1560s. Family of Love, which sought concord between the religions and love and reconciliation, unabashed sentimentality about what love can do in a time of fierce religious dissent. All members of the Christian community were joined, whatever their specific affiliations, however differently they pursued their rites and ceremonies. But why can we say, why can we not be sure? When I said, almost certain, why do I say it was almost certain that they belonged to this group? The reasons are clear. It's not just my being evasive. At a time when so much blood was spilled over the number of sacraments, over whether salvation was by faith alone or could be helped along by good works, whether grace was predestined or not, and so on and so forth, to insist on the unity of Christianity, let alone, even of Christianity, let alone Islam, where life and death matters, especially but not only in printing centers such as Antwerp. It was a time when informants were everywhere and charges of death-meriting heresy were alleged on the slimmest of pretexts. People who believed in such apparently obvious or innocuous ideas had to go underground or act clandestinely. They may have gone to church like good Christians, like Rubens later on Sundays, and celebrated the Catholic Mass. But what mattered for the Family Love and its affiliates was the imitation of Christ himself and of his humble, charitable, and loving life. Though outwardly Catholic and observant of its rites, inwardly all the members of this group realized that these outward things did not matter. They had a term for them. They were what they then called adiaphora, matters of indifference. Central to this was the need to extend Christ's love to all sects and groups, however partisan. That, of course, required that more than just a few shared these ecumenical beliefs. All this was is indeed pretty liberal, as we might now say. But there was one difference. The familists and Irenicists of the day had to be what Calvin despisingly called Nicodemists, people for whom outward show did not matter, because only true inward belief mattered. It was a secret that required to be closely kept. That is why increasingly scholars are finding that the ecumenical message was conveyed by arcane treatises and hidden messages in works of alchemy and in the popular emblematic literature of the time, in which you could cloak your true belief in disguised and safer form. These were works that circulated widely across many borders and included hidden messages in abundance. You have to open these alchemical texts. They seem totally obscure. You have to open these emblem literature. They seem totally puzzling. But in the end, most of them, and certainly the ones that Francis Yates was talking about, this was a big, widespread literature, were making irenic proposals. You had to have concord, above all, in times of war. And so this is where she was coming from. And in fact, I'm going to cut a section here. I was going to talk about the famous series known as the Valois tapestries, because tapestries are always very hard to see. And I only was going to talk about them partly because there's a great drawing for one of the festivities for which they were made in the 1580s. They were given to Catherine de Medici. This is a drawing here, which is actually by Antoine Caron in the Morgan Library. It's a drawing for these tapestries which was adapted by Bruegel's friend Lucas de Hera, to whom we will return. But she had a theory that these tapestries were made to solicit funds from Catherine herself, who of course was responsible for the St. Bartholomew Day massacre in 1572, a great anti-Protestant move, as you will remember. And these tapestries, Frances Yates alleged, were made to provide funds for her son here, René Duc d'Anjou, who was sent briefly to rule over Antwerp at the height of the Troubles in 1582. And he was known for his, what were then called his politique, this is the French word that was used, views that were distinctly conciliatory and flexible, as if adapted to as many sides in the then raging conflict as possible. They were indeed, as we still say in English, politic views, well adjusted to appeal to as many sides in a conflict as possible. So the Yates theory that these tapestries, it's now been rejected by most scholars, but the Yates theory was that these tapestries were commissioned as a show of support for these politic views of François, Duc, thinking of another, Duc d'Anjou, François Duc d'Anjou, and his own rule in Antwerp with these distinctly conciliatory ideas failed very swiftly. But you get the idea. Although the Duc d'Anjou was in Antwerp only for a couple of years, it was a brief remission in the wars between the horrible Spanish fury of 1576, which had sacked the churches of Antwerp anew, and the death of William of Orange in 1584, and the final securing of the south for Catholic and Habsburg Spain. So I've glossed over this long account, but that's how Frances Yates sort of came into the picture. In her works on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, she also showed that it was driven by these ecumenical beliefs. But I'm bringing you here to this period between 1576, the Spanish Fury, and the death of William of Orange in 1584, because this was the environment into which Rubens was born. It was a period of continuing strife between Catholic and Protestant, and consequent mobility between South and North, with thousands of people fleeing the war-torn South for more congenial places up to Holland and east towards Germany. Now, Rubens's own father, the lawyer Jan Rubens, who had been a leading figure in the town council of Antwerp. So when Bruegel was there, Jan Rubens was a leading figure in that town council, but he, until the Iconoclasm of 1566, and he had fled Antwerp to Cologne in 1568 to escape Alva's Inquisition and the time of troubles. There, in Cologne, he began an affair with none other than some of you know this, of course, but it's a good story, than the wife of William of Orange, the rich Anna of Saxony. Jan was thrown into jail, and it was only when Anna died in 1577 that Jan was fully released from arrest, and that his son Peter Paul was born. Swiftly the family, because Rubens's beloved mother never gave up famously on her wayward husband. In fact, she seems to have loved him more and more. But swiftly they returned to Antwerp. And so Rubens began his life in a city that was ever more Catholic, but would never regain its recent prosperity. Its decline continued both because of the continuing strife with the north and the silting up of the river that brought the ships into its great port. And as Antwerp declined, so Amsterdam rose. But that's another story, though not, as we shall see, entirely unrelated. As you can imagine from that drawing of Lot and his wife, Job's grumpy wife, and the fierce Judith, that drawing, Rubens was not really a prodigy in painting or in fact drawing before he went to Italy in 1600. But he certainly learned his classical stuff in the schools of Antwerp. Fueled by the great editions printed by Plantin, he and his older brother Philip became learned antiquarians, knowing almost everything there was to know about classical literature and classical antiquity. They became experts on ancient sculpture, coins, and all manner of ancient objects, from seals and rings to mirrors, lamps, and tripods. Skip these. This is a letter which is in the Morgan Library. I think it's actually on display in the exhibition as well, and it shows all these objects. This is to his friend, the great antiquarian Peiresc, his studies of tripods, vessels, how many feet, how were the shapes of the feet, at least on the tripod. This is a very typical letter. They discuss this in terms of their ancient sources in very, very great detail. It was inevitable that these scholars should have had one great hero, the famous philosopher and antiquarian Justus Lipsius, who regarded Philip, Rubens's brother, as his favorite pupil and amanuensis. Their relationship is recorded in not one, but two pictures. So the relationship between, in fact, Rubens and his brother, and Lipsius and other scholars in Antwerp. Here in the famous picture which he did in Mantua around 1605, 1605, very sultry Mantua in the background, Lipsius. It has been argued that this was a death picture, but I don't think it was, because Lipsius died in 1606, and here is the young Rubens, and there his brother Philip, and there two other scholars. Someone even suggested this may be Galileo, who was around Mantova at the time, but that's not been not been regarded as a convincing proposition. I think it's also been regarded as the German antiquarian Johannes Faber and two younger men. But in this picture, the famous picture in the Pitti Palace, which Rubens painted just after he returned to Antwerp in 1608, this one is sort of much more interesting for us because it shows, again, there's Rubens, there's his brother Philip, there's Lipsius, and there is Lipsius's other favorite assistant, Johannes Fulverius. But above them is a statue of the man, the antique source they all admired, Seneca. So I'm going to say something about Seneca now. And this is almost certainly with those fading flowers, those fading tulips coming out of Seneca, the great philosopher of Stoicism, as we'll see in a moment. It's very likely, especially looking at this picture, that this was a kind of post-mortem picture in honor of Lipsius. He died in 1606. Although the relationship of these men was bonded through antiquity, they were joined by something that was still more important to them in their times, that of Stoic philosophy, or the Christianized version now generally called Neo-Stoicism. Stoicism, as the very name implies, was a doctrine of reason in the face of passion, imperturbability in the face of emotion, patience and constancy in a time of volatility, prejudice and tribulation. Their antiquarianism provided an outlet. Listen to how the letter I have just shown you ends, the letter I just showed you. Everyone marvels, Rubens writes to Peiresc, that in so great a public calamity you remain with a mind so composed that you can, with customary pleasure, continue your noble research in the observation of antiquities. This is an example of a well-ordered soul imbued with true philosophy. Even so, I hope that with the arrival of this letter, the evil will have passed and you will at length return to your sacred museum. That's the museum he had in his own house. That's why we're often here in the museum too, in our own troubled times. Stoicism was not only a personal doctrine advocating that one remain as indifferent as possible to the troubles of life and the emotions that strike one in the face, that rack one in the face of loss and pain. For Lipsius, apatheia, emotionlessness, was better than empathy as an antidote to the religious and political passions of the time. It's easy to see the relevance of such an attitude to life in a time of interreligious strife and shifting international enmities. Better to remain detached and indifferent than to be swayed by passions and emotion. To take a position that all matters of indifference were of difference. To take the position that all matters of difference were really matters of indifference. Adiaphora, as the ancients would have said, and that all religious and national affiliations were equal. This, of course, was a pretty heretical position and may even be unattainable in the end. In a painting of around 1610, you know it, in Munich, Rubens painted the great archetype of Stoicism, Seneca again. This bust, by the way, is always supposed in the 17th century to have been Seneca, but we now know it to have been an African fisherman, or supposed to have been an African fisherman. Seneca, so here he paints this great archetype of Stoicism, Seneca, who finally killed himself by cutting his wrists in his bath when he could no longer tolerate the escapades of his mercurial and destructive master, the Emperor Nero. Indeed, Lipsius not only edited the works of Seneca, illustrated by Rubens himself. So here's the edition of Seneca's work. He had edited Seneca's work. This is the Opera Omnia of Lipsius, which I show you over here. But there, on the left, is the bust of Seneca again in Lipsius's edition of the collected works of Seneca. But he also, Lipsius, wrote 3 works specifically on the philosophy of Stoicism, including one entitled The De Constantia, about constancy in the face of external as much as internal troubles, which became one of the Bibles of 16th and 17th century Neo-Stoicism and was certainly read by Rubens and his brother. And yet, how ironic. You might indeed think that such an attitude to life were pretty much unsustainable, as even Seneca discovered in the end, when he did himself in. In his own life, Lipsius was anything but constant in the ways in which he yielded to the ups and downs of the times. Brought up as a Catholic in the southern Netherlands, when things became too difficult there, he converted to Protestantism and emigrated to Leiden, where he taught in the newly founded prestige university of the rebel provinces, until he was called back by the siren song of his old religion, Catholicism, and even wrote 3 books on miraculous images, the very hallmark of popular Catholic devotion, many would say of superstition and anything but reason. But this was the man whom Rubens missed above all. After returning to Antwerp in 1608, hurrying back there because of the illness of his mother, but just too late to be there beside her deathbed, Rubens, at least on the face of it, could not have been more caught up in his devotion to the Catholic faith. Within the year, he celebrated what would be an exceptionally happy marriage to Isabella Brandt, the daughter of another Antwerp lawyer, and delivered for the occasion one of the most wonderful marriage portraits ever made. I'm not going to talk about it. It is one of the most wonderful marriage portraits ever made, especially with his orange hose. Though, of course, he supplied his secular patrons with paintings of all subjects, many from classical antiquity, you know those, as the Rape of the Daughters of Leucippus, and several wonderful personal portraits of young child Nicholas, as well as landscapes, so landscape from the middle of the 2nd decade, Buckingham Palace, in Windsor Castle. From the day he came back, he supplied church after church, though he did these other more personal pictures. From the day he came back to Antwerp, he supplied church after church with altarpieces and other religious paintings to replace those which had been destroyed in the Protestant iconoclasm of the century into which he was born. The churches of Antwerp were being rebuilt, and Rubens was their prime supplier. As I've said, you know, there is the Jesuit church. Again, the interior, everything designed by Rubens, the altarpieces, the sculptures, and of course, the paintings, no fewer than 4. But throughout all this, throughout his glittering successes, Rubens remained deeply worried. The Netherlands was supposed to be one, to be unified, but they were deeply divided now into 2. They all spoke Dutch, after all. Antwerp's decline as a commercial center and port continued, while Amsterdam rose inexorably. The religious divisions became still more acid than before. Economic prosperity was dependent on religious peace in his view. All his life, from those early Antwerp days on, Rubens sought to heal the wounds between the Catholic South and the basically, though not totally, Protestant North. Swiftly, his personal commitment to Stoicism was transformed into a political one as well. Only through regarding political and religious difference as the result of too great an attention to ritual and ceremony, too full of passion and emotion, and too little dependent on reason and coolness could peace be achieved. The chance, of course, came through his art. And at the beginning of the bloodiest conflict thus far in European history, the 30 Years' War, it was the product of strife between those two powers. Barely had Rubens completed his work for the Jesuit church in Antwerp in 1618, when the Prague Protestants tossed the emissaries of the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand out of the windows of Prague Castle, the famous defenestration of Prague. It was the start of the bitter war that would only end in 1648, 8 years after Rubens's death. But at this stage, it was at this stage that Rubens's diplomatic missions in search of peace began in earnest. Understanding full well that peace could not be established between the two parts of the Netherlands without first reconciling Spain with Holland, he realized that Britain had to be brought into the picture as well, because Britain had relationships with both of them, or soon would have. It had long had a close relationship with the northern Netherlands, Britain, and even though James I had been a Catholic, his son Charles was clearly Anglican, despite being married to Henrietta Maria of France. You can see how complicated this all gets. So it became essential to explore the possibility of peace between those two old enemies, Britain and Spain. Rubens saw his opportunity. He swiftly intensified his relationship with the three greatest art lovers of Britain, Dudley Carleton, the Duke of Buckingham, close friend of Charles I, and the Earl of Arundel. A whole other chapter. There is, of course, now that wonderful exhibition, the Royal Academy in London, about the collections of Charles I, which were the culmination of these kinds of relationships. But he intensified his relations with all those three great art lovers, trading in antiquities and with his own pictures. So I really should have shown you the lion hunt, which was the height of his discussions with Dudley Carleton, but instead, because we're talking about drawings, these two magnificent drawings, that actually for the Daniel in the Lion's Den. Here, another lion, also for the Daniel's Den, with unexpected use of yellow watercolor in addition to the white heightening, constantly innovative Rubens, but just to remind us of the great variety of stuff which Rubens did for all his English patrons. In 1621, energized by his artistic successes, he saw his chance to merge art and politics. In January of that year, he wrote to the King's Secretary, William Trumbull, saying, you all remember this great phrase, not shy phrase, I confess that I am by natural instinct better fitted to execute very large works than small curiosities, everyone according to his gifts. My talent is such that no undertaking, however vast or in size or diversified in subject, has ever surpassed my courage. Here's a guy who has no doubt about his abilities. And so Rubens immediately received the commission to paint the ceiling of the new banqueting hall in London beside the splendid palace at Whitehall, designed by Inigo Jones. And this at pretty much the same time that he was also painting the immense series of paintings commissioned by Marie de Medici, once of Florence, but now of France, and mother of the soon-to-be Queen of England, for her palace in Paris. Even while continuing to paint indefatigably for the churches of Antwerp, he thus took on huge commissions in Paris and in London. But even in the Medici cycle, that cycle which still tires but nevertheless amazes one in the Louvre, one can see the emphasis on that key element of Stoic doctrine, concord. That great series itself provides evidence of Rubens's constant preoccupations with themes of political reconciliation, as, for example, we see in the painting of the tapestry, the painting here, tapestry, of the exchange of the princesses, when you remember you had Anne of Austria, being presented to her future husband, Louis of France, with France behind on the right, and Elizabeth, the future wife of Philip IV of Spain. These relationships were intended to secure the concord which they sought. And then, of course, also important in this cycle are the great scenes of concord between young Louis XIII and his mother, the regent Marie de Medici. Huge tensions between them, but Rubens insists on emphasizing the elements of concord, and here they are finally reconciled, of course, by, you can see the heart enclosed in a wreath. There's Louis, there's his mother, and the truth being carried up by time there. So these already here, he doesn't resist a single opportunity to emphasize the importance of achieving concord, even in the face of the slightly subversive efforts of the super shrewd Cardinal Richelieu who came on the scene and who subverted everything, actually, in the end. The painter's energy was huge, prodigious. Back in Antwerp, after completing the first part of the Medici cycle devoted to the Queen, the next part would be dedicated to Marie's husband, Henri IV, born a Catholic, brought up as a Protestant, reconverted to Catholicism just like Lipsius, and therefore hated by all sides. So he finally completed his great Assumption. I mean, this man, I'm talking fast because this man is working fast and big. So back in Antwerp, he quickly finishes his long commissioned Assumption for the high altar of Antwerp Cathedral, on which he'd been working off and on for many years, installed in June 1626. Within a month, his beloved wife, Isabella, had died. He was devoted to her and shattered. I always think this very beautiful drawing, typical of a bunch of drawings made around 1618, in their combination of chalks, white heightened, black chalk, colored chalks, white heightened, wonderful hair. As you can see, there's a whole series of drawings related to this with the same means, but she always struck me as being looking quite strained in that picture. So at any rate, so within a month of the putting up of the cathedral, his beloved wife had died. And he writes that famous letter, and one of his most moving letters. Listen to it. It begins predictably enough with a clear reference to the stoicism necessary for dealing with such a loss. But then Rubens, like any human would, wobbles. You do well to remind me of, he writes to Peiresc, you do well to remind me of the necessity of fate, which does not comply with our passions, and which, as an expression of the supreme power, is not obliged to render us an account of its actions. It has absolute fate, it has absolute dominion over all things, and we only serve and obey. There is nothing to do but to make the servitude more honorable and less painful by submitting willingly. But at present such duty is neither easy nor even possible. You're very prudent in commending me to time, and I hope that this will do for me what reason ought to do. For I have no pretensions, he said, about ever attaining a stoic equanimity. I do not believe that human feelings so closely in accord with their object, that's his wife, are unbecoming to man's nature, or that one can be equally, there's the term again, indifferent to all things in this world. It's a moving and noble letter. So much for Stoicism, so much for reason. At such a time, who could be expected to submit stoically to fate? Human feelings are what matter, and one cannot be indifferent to suffering in this world. And so Rubens deflected his personal loss, sublimated, one might now say, into an extraordinary period of even greater artistic and political activity, using his art as the cover for negotiations for peace at every stage of his life. For the next 5 years, he gained access to the kings of England and Spain, whose esteem for him seemed unbounded, and so the great age of shuttle diplomacy began. He was desperately working on the possibility of peace agreements between those old enemies, Protestant England and most Catholic Spain. Off he went to Spain to paint for Philip IV, the great lover of Titian. And what did Rubens do, amongst many other things, but copy the masterpieces of his greatest coloristic rival ever, Titian? It's said that Philip came to watch Rubens paint these works in the royal collections, and one can only begin to imagine what else they would have talked about in the midst of these most beautiful of the Venetians' works, as you remember. The artistic relationship between these two paintings is, of course, the whole story. Many people have discussed it, and I just show you of the two poesia which Rubens copied. So you can see, it's actually very clear. This is a great art historical thing. He copied these pictures very carefully. Titian on the left, Rubens on the right. Titian on the left, Rubens on the right again. So, as I say, this is no time for a class on this, but it would be nice. So it's amongst the greatest tributes ever made by one painter to another. And in them, Rubens's poetic strain competes equally with that of Titian's own famous poesia. But alas, not much headway was made on the diplomatic front. And so Rubens returned to London again, at last to paint the ceiling of the new banqueting house in Whitehall. And here too, I remember, this is impossible to see. You have to lie on your back that's the only way to do it when you go to Whitehall. They give you mirrors to wheel around, but it doesn't work. Otherwise you get a great pain in your neck. Here too, painting for a Catholically inclined Anglican with a Catholic wife, the themes that would occupy him for the rest of his life could not appear more plainly. It was not just that the beasts of war could be tamed by angelic putti of peace. These are angels playing with these putti, at least playing with these wild animals, lions and leopards. This is a theme which he'd studied in antiquity with his friend Pierre for many years on antique coins or medals. And, fury was here overcome by reason and wisdom, and, of course, England and Scotland were united by James, actually first, and then by Charles. So peace embraces plenty, Minerva pushes out rebellious war. There, England and Scotland are united under the crown of the crown of wreaths above. But, and then he did something more. He made two pictures as gifts to Charles. One, simply, this is a little-known, very beautiful dark landscape, showing, of course, St. George, the patron saint of England, in this most idyllic of landscapes to save his French and Catholic wife from the dragon. And the other, of course, is the famous painted demonstration of peace and prosperity that ensues when wisdom, personified by Athena, you see in the middle, pushes out Mars, and here Venus directs a jet of milk into the mouth of this putto, and Hymen crowns these children in anticipation of their marriage, and the satyr is trampling on the wild beast, and he offers a cornucopia, and Harmony brings in stuff from the side, jewels, and so on. Rubens was indefatigable. Oh wait, that's an extract from later on, but he was indefatigable. Nothing gelled, however, at least not with any practical results. The wars between the two great powers continued. So I'm moving fast to reach our end, but this is a picture worth dwelling on, because it is clearly a picture that is intended as a painted plea for peace. The dark clouds behind rebellious Mars, Athena pushing him away, so that Harmony on the left and Venus in the middle can sustain these children for the future in this idyllic landscape. But even with all this access, Rubens's hectic diplomatic activity, facilitated by his painting and thus providing access to all the leading players, came to naught. In 1630, at 53 years old, he fell in love with the 16-year-old Hélène Froment and promptly married her. It's the great portrait of her in her wedding dress in Munich. Sometimes it seems he barely stopped painting her. There's the picture in the Met, many times repainted, but still a beautiful one there, of course, with their child, Albert. The international stage pretty much yielded to the local one. Large-scale war to domestic love and peace. You remember that picture to which we return of Hélène on the way to the bath, I always say, wrapping herself quickly in a fur. But even as he retired to his new country house in Stein, it's on the market now, by the way. Apparently for 6 million euros, so go, it's in perfect condition. A friend of mine sent me this, an ad for it. Rubens was indefatigable. He traveled to his still large workshop at his townhouse in Antwerp, and his production continued unabated. The religious and secular commissions still poured in, and his energies were unabated, even fired up, it seems, by his newfound domestic bliss. But still the themes of reconciliation and concord continued, even perhaps more than previously. I don't think this has been commented upon enough, perhaps because many of the most relevant of these are not Rubens's most beautiful works. But they are there. Just look at these themes of reconciliation. This is Abram and Melchizedek, a theme which he'd taken on much earlier, now taken up again in the 1630s. Abigail before David. And then this rather astonishing picture, which is people don't look at it because it seems typically complicated, Rubens and allegorical. It's the meeting of Ferdinand of Hungary and the Cardinal Infante of Spain at the Battle of Nördlingen. This is the very young Cardinal Infante of Spain over here, and the Elector Palatinate over there. But despite this, so this is the meeting before their joint victory over Protestant forces 4 days later. But despite this, see how Germany in the foreground, here, alongside the river Danube, there, of course, river god, is dressed all in black and gazes mournfully out at the viewer with a typical pathos formula of sadness, the head on the hand on the cheek on the hand, the typical pathos formula of sadness and melancholy. Indeed, she seems to represent inner sadness, the inner sadness which continued to gnaw at Rubens beneath the pleasures of home and country life. Though no longer active on the larger European stage, Rubens knew as well as anyone how complex these shifting alliances could be and how fraught they inevitably were. These themes punctuate all his work, even if he was not seeking to activate them on the larger stage. This painting was in fact a design for one of the huge set of decorations which Rubens made for the triumphal entry of the Cardinal Infante into Antwerp in 1636. It would take at least a month's worth of lectures to set out all its details, but let me just show you the design. I wanted to show you this design. It's one of the most exciting elements in the whole of the Pompa Introitus Ferdinandi. I love this. This is the design for the temporary stage, which is like floats and paper mache decorations on a huge scale, which were erected on the streets of Antwerp, and then the commemorative booklet, which is a huge, it's a huge folio volume. You see it more clearly. Here you see comes the god of war, pushing out the personification of war, pushing out the doors of the temple of peace, blindfold, unrespecting of persons, in order to begin his destructive program of discord, as Isabella Clara Eugenia, the daughter of Philip III of Spain, helped by the goddess of peace, strive to push the doors of war closed. See? They're desperately trying to keep the doors of war closed. There is Isabella Clara Eugenia. Here are the attendants of war pulling them open, pushing them closed. Here's blindfold, from the temple of Janus. It's hard not to notice that the forces of destructive war here are male, those of peace and concord, female. More or less at the same time, Rubens painted his final testament to his awareness of the horrors of war. You all know it, the great picture in the Pitti Palace in Florence, done for the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and still in the Pitti Palace. And he describes it better than I ever could in a famous letter he wrote to his fellow Flemish painter, Justus Sustemans. I just quickly read it to you. Many of you will know it, but it's worth reading. The principal figure is Mars. I'm too close, but I think you can all see it. You'll see it all. Principal figure of Mars, who has left the open temple of Janus, which in time of peace, according to Roman custom, remained closed, as we've just seen. I'm reading Rubens's letter. And rushes forth with shield and blood-stained sword, threatening the people with great disaster. He pays little heed to Venus, who, accompanied by her Amors and Cupids, strives with caresses and embraces to hold him back. From the other side, Mars is dragged forward by the Fury Alecto. There she is, you see. with a torch in her hand. Nearby are monsters personifying pestilence and famine, those inseparable partners of war. On the ground, turning her back, lies a woman with broken lute, representing harmony, which is incompatible with the discord of war. There is also a mother with her child in her arms, indicating that fecundity, procreation, and charity are thwarted by war. In addition, an architect is thrown on his back with his instrument in his hands. Here's this poor architect with his instruments in his hands, thrown on his back, to show that in time of that which in time of peace is constructed for the use and ornamentation of the city is hurled to the ground by the force of arms and falls to ruin. On the ground under the feet of Mars, a book as well as a drawing on paper. Drawings and books go too, to imply that he treads underfoot all the arts and letters. There ought also to be a bundle of darts or arrows with the band which held them together undone. Though these, when bound, form the symbol of concord. Beside them is the caduceus and an olive branch, attribute of peace. These are also cast aside. The grief-stricken woman clothed in black with torn veil, robbed of all her jewels and other ornaments, is the unfortunate Europe. Unfortunate Europe, who for so many years now has suffered plunder, outrage, and misery, which are so injurious to everyone, so on. Europe's attribution is the globe borne by a small angel and surmounted by the cross, the symbol of the Christian world. So it's the Christian world, it's not Catholicism, the whole world. Throughout his life, from almost the time of his return to Antwerp, I'm almost there. Throughout his life, from almost the time of his return to Antwerp from Italy 30 years earlier, Rubens had always acknowledged the decivilizing powers of war and the destruction of the arts and sciences, just as, in fact, had Bruegel's friends in these very clumsy, whoops, there you see some details. These are really funny pictures, I admit, but they were painted by Bruegel's friend, acquaintance Lucas de Heere, which show the sleeping arts in time of war, and then a drawing by de Heere's friend Joris Hufnagel, which shows the same there. Arts do not flourish, nor arts and sciences fail in times of war. This, in a way, is the great Flemish and Dutch tradition that still just persists. But in the face of the failure of Stoicism, of the failure of Rubens's efforts at reconciliation, concord, even of equanimity, what remained of his ecumenism? Where could he find concord and peace, hope and personal equanimity? The answer lies before us, at home, in the countryside, away from the torments of war. It sounds sentimental, but there's another interesting dimension, obvious perhaps, but more interesting, I think, than has generally been understood. His interest in the inhabitants of the countryside, country people, has occasionally been noted, but rarely thought through. And in a way, it helps to explain the one truly mysterious drawing in today's, in the show upstairs, the sermon in a country church. You have to go up and look at the drawing closely because I can't imagine. This is very pale watercolors on this very pretty pen and ink drawing. Not everyone believes it to be by Rubens. I think on balance it is. I'm not 100% convinced, but you'll see how it fits anyway with my concluding points. Not everyone believes this drawing to be by Rubens, but even though it seems to be very far away from his usual interests, I hope you can now see that it does, in this respect, make a certain sense. It shows a group of peasants in a simple, I'll show you a few details in a moment, in a simple country chapel, almost a barn, with a pulpit in it. Here's a pulpit, and there's obviously a priest making a sermon. Here, these attentive listeners, there's a row of peasants going off, some kind of wooden step up there, simple ceiling. scattering of agricultural implements, everyone listening intently to the sermon. It's certainly a Catholic service, to judge from the ecclesiastical costume worn by the priest. Perhaps it's the chapel of his own estate, Hedstein, although we know nothing about it. But what is clearly striking is the loving attention Rubens devoted to the listeners of this sermon. And here I have something of a surprise to introduce. Thank heavens, because the Rubens experts in this room will have known almost everything I've shown, will have known everything I've shown and cited, but not this, which I'm going to introduce now. And in fact, I only realized this after I'd settled on the topic of my paper with Ilona. One day, I've forgotten, but one day at Columbia, in the basement of my own building, Schermerhorn, I found, or somewhere underground up there, Upper West Side, underneath Columbia, I found a painting, which now hangs in my office. It's a work by a Rubens school painter, quite close in style to that of the master, but clearly not by him. It's obviously a copy of the lost original, or possibly an adaptation of the very drawing. Well, you just have to take, I don't suppose you can see much, it's the best we can do over here. It's a work by Rubens. The only difference is that in the painting, the painter has not had the audacity to show a completely peasant audience, since he's added two landowners at the side. Well, you can see this from here. We'll come back to them. In this painting, you see there's no landowners, they're just these simple people listening. And in fact, the priest is deprived of whatever his headgear is over there. But this is a portrait, actually. I think I know who it is. But what the copyist conveys with perhaps even greater clarity is the attentiveness of these rustic viewers. So this is the painting. Oops, excuse me. And these are quite close to the original, but they show the attentiveness of the viewers very strikingly indeed. Even though he has the nobles on the side, these are clearly ordinary people of the countryside. They are listening very carefully. It's perfectly true that in terms of my lecture today, you could say that it shows the people really engaged in a specifically Catholic sermon, that this has nothing to do with ecumenism, but rather with the persistence of traditional religious faith amongst the people. Oops, stay with this, sorry. But what I think has happened here is that Rubens, in his retirement, has come to realize that true faith lies with simple folk, as all the leaders of reform movements had always said, and none as fervently, for example, as the almost Flemish Thomas à Kempis in his Imitatio Christi, which lightly adapted became a kind of Bible for the ecumenical movements of the 16th century. I think it was this that also drives the palpable affection, that's emphasis on Christ's life and character, simplicity, humility, joined all humankind, or ought to. I think it's this that also drives the palpable affection and love with which Rubens not only portrayed the country landscape with his laborers in it. We really need these blow-ups that would have multiplied the slides, of the detail of these cows, the beautiful way, and this National Gallery picture is one of the greatest of all the landscapes, the beautiful treatment of the water, the big, thick strokes of yellow and orange in the water, the people harvesting on the left. But it's not only the country landscape with its laborers, but also their celebrations and rustic pleasures. No pictures exemplify this more than the great peasant dance in the Prado that so clearly recalls Bruegel's treatment of the theme. Well, I should say the peasant dance in the Prado and the robust Kermesse Flamande. This is the picture, of course, in the Louvre, which I have a detail of. Peasants wildly dancing, gracefully in the Prado picture, more wildly, retching even in the Louvre. And these clearly recall Bruegel's treatments of this very theme. He got the idea for these peasant dances from Bruegel himself. That's the great and slightly neglected picture in Detroit here on the screen now. And it also recalls the motto on one of Bruegel's engravings of a peasant feast, which has on the banner here, on the banner here is written, "Let the peasants hold their feasts. Let the peasants do their own thing. They're interesting, they're loving, they dance happily." There can be no question that the same spirit, not just of tolerance, but of acknowledgement that it was precisely in their robust independence from rule and constraint that the peasants set a moral example. But the humanist dimension remains. Rubens's work in the Prado was inspired by Titian's Andrians then in the Escorial, painted for Philip II 70 years earlier, and by Rubens's copy. Well, this is Rubens's copy there. That's Rubens's copy of the Andrians. And you see how these dancers recur in the great picture in the Prado. This wonderful picture also has a robust and charming coarseness about it, with, on the one hand, grace in the movements of the dance and considerable power in the way in which each figure here tries to get away from her or his partner in order to randomly chase after the partner of the other. If you look carefully, you see the one's always trying to get away. She's kissing the guy behind, he's looking at her, she's leading him off. And so throughout the picture. The partner's always getting off, trying to get off with the other. In this way, power and grace meet ecumenical Rubens. This randiness, by the way, also characterized the behavior and writings of some of the most famous Stoics and antiquarians of the time. I could tell you story of story. They were pleased with themselves, these people in search of concord, with descriptions of their sexual exploits or whatever they were trying to do or say. And libertinism swiftly became associated with liberalism, as much now as it was then. Although it's hard to say this, what I'm about to say, it's hard to say it in an age of high political correctness, we can now begin to see the connection between the evident pleasure with which Rubens portrayed his young wife and the stern, indeed stoic-looking portrait of himself painted just a few years, indeed stoic-looking portrait of himself painted just a few years earlier. The very picture of a man who transcended these purely earthly pleasures for the higher ideals of peace on earth and the healing of religious differences. This is the true meaning of ecumenical Rubens. Thank you.